I stood on the porch with a cardboard box in my arms, and I almost didn't knock. Inside it was everything I still had of my ex-wife, a folded maroon sweater, a pair of jeans, a gray towel, and the corner of a framed photograph pushing up against the flap. The porch light was warm and yellow. Somewhere behind the door, dinner was cooking, and the brass handle was cold under my knuckles. I only meant to set the box down and leave. I returned my ex-wife's stuff. Her mom invited me in and made me stay. And after that night, everything changed. My name is Sawyer Bishop. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the place people used to call Furniture City, back when half the country slept in beds and ate at tables that came out of this town. I like that history. I like belonging to a place that measures itself by what it makes with its hands. I make things too, though the road there wasn't a straight one. For a while I was an architect, a young one, ambitious, the kind who thought a name on a building was the same as a name that meant something. I was good at it. People told me I was going places. And then my father died, and something in me went quiet, and the going places slowed down until it simply stopped. My father was a woodworker. He taught me to plane a board flat before I could ride a bike. When he was gone, the drafting tables and the glass offices felt like someone else's life, so I walked away from them and went back to the only thing that had ever felt honest in my hands. I opened a small shop. I fix furniture people throw away and someone else decides they want back. I build the plain, patient things, chairs, shelves, cabinets that will outlive the people who order them. I build things people throw away and someone else wants back. Turns out that's also how I think about the past. I live alone. No children. My marriage ended 2 years ago, and I don't tell the story often, because most of it isn't a story so much as a slow leak, the kind you don't notice until the room is already empty. Her name was Bianca. We were married through the good years and the thin years, and then one morning the thin years were all that was left. So you can understand why, on that particular evening, I sat in my truck for a long minute before I got out. Bianca's mother, Lorraine, had texted me the week before. She was selling the old family house, the one on Eastern Avenue with the crooked porch step I'd fixed twice, and she'd found a box of things that were still, technically, mine to return. Old family photographs, mostly. A few of Bianca's leftovers I'd never gotten around to boxing up. I could have left it on the step. I want you to know I considered it. The thought of standing in that doorway and looking into the faces of people who used to be my family made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't name. I dreaded it. 2 years of silence, and here I was, delivering the last of a marriage in a cardboard box. I knocked. The hinge on the storm door still groaned the way it always had. I'd been meaning to oil it for years and never did. And the person who opened the door wasn't Lorraine. It was Cora. Cora is Bianca's younger sister. In all the years I'd known that family, she'd stayed just at the edge of every room, quiet, watchful, the one who cleared the plates while everyone else argued about nothing. I'd always thought of her as kind and hard to read, a still surface you couldn't see the bottom of. She looked at me on that porch like she'd been expecting me for longer than a week. "You came," she said. Just that. Like it mattered. I held up the box, a little stupidly, as if I needed to prove I had a reason to exist on her mother's porch. "I've got the photos. I won't keep you, I'll set these inside and get out of your way." Behind her, the house smelled like a kitchen in full swing, and a lamp burned low and yellow in the living room. My hands still smelled like linseed oil from the shop. Then Lorraine appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and the second she saw me her whole face changed. "Sawyer Bishop," she said, in the voice of a woman who has decided something and won't be argued with. "You are not dropping a box on my porch like a delivery man. You'll come in, and you'll eat." I opened my mouth to argue. Nobody argues with Lorraine Sutton. And God help me, I stepped inside. I told myself it was a one-time thing, that dinner. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks I found reasons to come back. Lorraine had a whole house to pack, and 40 years of a family doesn't fold itself into boxes. She needed someone to carry the heavy things down from the attic, to break down the old bed frames, to figure out why the dining room hutch wouldn't come loose from the wall. I had a truck and 2 working arms and, if I'm honest, an apartment I didn't much like being alone in. So I kept showing up. And every time I did, Cora was there. I didn't think much of it at first. It was her mother's house, where else would she be? But slowly I started to notice things, small things, the kind you don't add up until much later. The first evening I came to help, she handed me a mug of coffee without asking how I took it. Black, no sugar. Exactly right. Lucky guess, I said, and she just smiled and turned back to the box she was taping. It wasn't a lucky guess. I'd understand that later, too. In the back bedroom, pushed against the wall, was a bookshelf I recognized. I'd built it years ago, early in the marriage, a simple thing out of quartersawn oak that I'd made for Walter, Cora and Bianca's father. Walter had loved that shelf. He used to run his thumb along the joint where 2 boards met and shake his head like I'd done something impossible. No nails, he'd say to anyone who'd listen. The boy did the whole thing with no nails. Walter was gone now, too. He'd passed the same spring my marriage ended, a brutal year, that one, though I still didn't say those words out loud. And here was his bookshelf, kept, dusted, still standing. When I asked Lorraine if she wanted it wrapped for the move, it was Cora who answered. "That one stays with me," she said. Quick. Certain. Like the question had a wrong answer and she'd headed it off before it could land. Her hands, I noticed, were a maker's hands, nicked and dry, a pale gray dust worked permanently into the creases. She was a potter. She had a studio set up in the old detached garage out back, and while I worked in the house I could hear the low hum of her kiln through the wall, a sound almost exactly like the shop compressor I fell asleep to most nights. 2 people who spent their days turning raw material into something meant to last. I remember thinking, without really thinking about it, that we made sense in the same room. She remembered things about me I'd forgotten I'd ever said. That I couldn't stand the smell of walnut stain. That I always sat in the same chair at the end of the kitchen table, the one nearest the window, and that somehow that chair was always empty and wiped clean when I arrived, no matter how full the house got. One afternoon a stack of newspapers slid off the counter and we both reached for them at once and knocked heads, and she laughed. A real laugh, low and surprised, the first one I'd heard from her in years. For a second the smell of old newsprint and the dust hanging gold in the afternoon light made the whole room feel like a memory I hadn't lived yet. "You always fixed the things nobody else had patience for," she said another day, watching me coax a swollen drawer back onto its runners. "They're just chairs, Cora," I said. "Drawers. Wood. It's not complicated." She was quiet for a moment. Then, so soft I almost missed it, "I wasn't talking about the chairs." I let it go. I'm telling you this now, from where I'm standing today, and I can see it plainly, but in that moment I let it slide right past me. I thought she was being kind because I used to be married to her sister. I thought that was the whole of it. It never crossed my mind that whatever she carried might have a history, that it was nearly as old as the friendship I'd had with her father, sitting in that house the entire time, quiet and patient, waiting for me to look up from the drawer in my hands. There were evenings when it was just the 3 of us, Lorraine and Cora and me, eating leftovers off mismatched plates because the good dishes were already wrapped in newspaper in a box by the door. Lorraine would tell the same stories she'd been telling for years, and I'd realize I'd missed them, missed being folded into a family, missed the ordinary warmth of a table that expected you. I hadn't had that in 2 years. Maybe longer. Bianca and I, toward the end, had eaten most of our dinners in separate rooms. Walter used to pull me out to the garage after those Sunday dinners, back before it was Cora's studio. He and I would work on something small, a stool, a cutting board, while everyone else cleared the table. I'd assumed, all those years, that it was just the 2 of us out there in the sawdust and the yellow bulb light. It never once occurred to me to wonder who might be watching from the kitchen window. The photographs were the last thing we packed. Lorraine had boxes of them, decades deep, and one evening the three of us sat on the living room floor sorting the ones worth keeping from the ones nobody could name anymore. Near the bottom of the box I'd carried in that first night was the framed one, the corner I'd seen sticking out on the porch. A summer barbecue in the backyard, maybe 10 years back. Walter at the grill. Bianca laughing at something off to the side. Me, younger, squinting into the sun with a beer in my hand. And Cora, at the edge of the frame, half in shadow. I barely glanced at it. I set it on the keep pile and reached for the next. Cora picked it back up. Held it a beat longer than she'd held any of the others. "Can I keep this one?" she asked. Lorraine said, "Of course, take whatever you want, honey." And Cora said, by way of explanation, not quite looking at me, "It has Dad in it." It did have Dad in it. That was true. Walter was right there at the grill, tongs in hand, grinning at something. It was a true reason, and it was a good one, and I nodded and thought nothing more of it. I know now that it was a true reason laid carefully over a truer one. But that night I just handed her the photo and went back to sorting, and outside the kitchen window the light went from gold to gray, and I drove home through the quiet streets not knowing that anything at all had happened. That's the thing about the moments that change your life. You almost never recognize them while you're standing inside them. You just feel, faintly, that you don't want to leave the room you're in, that some ordinary evening has quietly become the place your whole life turns on, and you'd give anything to make it last a little longer. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me across a half-packed room, and she'd look away so fast I'd tell myself I'd imagined it. I imagined it a lot, apparently. There was an afternoon we spent wrapping her father's old hand tools, chisels and a block plane Walter had kept oiled long after his hands stopped being steady enough to use them, and Cora held each one for a second before she let me set it in the box, the way you hold something that still has a person's warmth in it. "He'd have wanted you to have these," she said, and pressed the block plane into my hands and closed my fingers over it and didn't let go for a moment longer than she needed to. I took it for grief. It was grief. It was also something else, and I was the only one in the room who couldn't see it. I set the plane on the workbench in my own shop that night, and for a week I couldn't look at it without a strange, warm ache I refused to name, an ache with no name I was willing to give it. The change came all at once, the way weather does here, clear 1 hour, and then the whole sky. It started with a phone call from a woman named Priya Anand. I hadn't heard her name in years. She'd been a junior architect at the firm I left, barely 2 years out of school when I walked away, and she'd stayed. Now she was calling because the Riverside Reading Pavilion, the little glass and timber building down by the water that I designed the year before my father died, had just won a state heritage award. The trouble was the name attached to it. For years the credit had belonged to Desmond Cole, the senior partner who'd been running the firm when everything came apart. When my father died and the firm restructured, I'd been quietly moved aside, and somewhere in that shuffle the pavilion became Desmond's building. I never fought it. I was grieving, I was done, and a name on a wall didn't seem worth the war. So I let it go and went home to my father's tools. Priya hadn't let it go. She'd kept the original drawings, the stamped set, the ones with my initials in the corner of every sheet and the dated revisions in my handwriting. When the award brought the pavilion back into the light, she brought the drawings to a reporter. And the reporter ran the story. For about a week, my name was in places it hadn't been in years. My phone did things it hadn't done since the divorce. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what to feel. It was vindication, I suppose, but it arrived so late and so quietly that mostly it just felt strange, like getting a letter meant for a younger man who no longer lived at that address. Then Bianca came back. I should have seen it coming. Later I put the timeline together, her thing with Blake Corrigan, the man she'd left me for, the one with the boat and the opinions, had fallen apart around the same time my name resurfaced. She'd heard I was, in her word, back. And so on a Thursday evening, while I was on the floor of her mother's living room wrapping glasses in newspaper next to Cora, the front door opened without a knock, and there she was. For a moment nobody moved. Bianca stood in the doorway in a coat that cost more than my truck, looking at the three of us on the floor, her mother, her sister, and her ex-husband, packing up her childhood home like a little family. I watched something curdle in her face. "Well," she said. "Isn't this cozy?" Lorraine got to her feet slowly. "Bianca. You didn't say you were coming." "Clearly." Bianca's eyes moved over the room and landed on me, and her mouth did the thing I remembered too well, the smile that was really a blade. "You know, I almost didn't believe it. Sawyer Bishop, in the paper. You were a nobody with a saw for 2 years, and now there's an award, and suddenly everyone remembers your name." She laughed. "How convenient, the timing. Right when there's finally something to come sniffing around for." "I came to return your photographs," I said. "That's all." "Of course you did." Her gaze slid to Cora then, and I saw her take in the whole picture, the way we were sitting, the ease of it, the mug of coffee at my elbow that her sister had made without asking. And I watched her decide to use the one thing she knew that I didn't. She crossed the room and picked the framed photograph off the keep pile. The glass caught the lamplight as she turned it toward me, and her voice went soft and cruel. "Look at this. Look who's staring at whom." She tapped the glass, right at the edge of the frame, right at her sister in the shadows. "You never noticed, did you? 10 years. My little sister has been in love with you for 10 years, Sawyer. Picking at my leftovers the whole time, waiting around like a dog under the table. Everybody knew. Everybody but you." The room went completely silent. Somewhere the refrigerator hummed. I was still holding a glass wrapped halfway in newspaper, and I remember setting it down very carefully, because my hands had started to shake and I didn't trust them. And then, for the first time, I actually looked at the photograph. Really looked. 10 years of my own blindness, laid out in a single frame. Walter grinning at the grill. Bianca turned away, laughing at someone else. Me, squinting at the sun. And Cora, not looking at the camera, not looking at the food, not looking at anything a person is supposed to look at in a picture like that. Looking at me. Half in shadow at the edge of the frame, with an expression on her young face that I had somehow walked past 1,000 times without ever once seeing it for what it was. I kept my eyes on it because I couldn't make myself look up at her yet. Every detail I'd walked past for a decade was suddenly loud. The tilt of her head. The way her whole young face had turned toward me and away from everything a photograph is supposed to be about. It was not a glance. It was not a coincidence of where she happened to be standing. It was a girl of 20 looking at a man who was married to her sister, with no hope of anything and no intention of ever saying so, and it had been printed and framed and sitting in a box in my closet for 10 years, and every single day of those 10 years I had been too busy chasing the wrong sister to turn my head 6 inches and see the one person in that whole bright yard who had only ever been looking at me. I looked up. Cora hadn't moved. Her face had gone very still and very pale, and she was staring at the floor like she wanted it to open. "Bianca." Lorraine's voice cut across the room, low and hard, a tone I'd never once heard from her in all the years I'd known her. "Sit down. Or get out. But you do not walk into my house after all this time and do that to your sister." She stepped between them. "You gave up your seat at this table. You don't get to come back and set fire to it." Bianca's smile flickered. For a second she looked almost surprised, the way people do when the thing they've always been allowed to get away with finally meets a wall. She set the photograph down. She looked at me one more time, searching for something, the old power, maybe, the pull she used to have, and I think she saw that it was gone. "Enjoy your leftovers," she said. And she turned and walked out. The door shut behind her, not with a slam but with a soft, final click that was somehow worse, and the silence it left behind was thick enough to stand in. Cora was already on her feet. Before I could say a word, she was gone too, out the back, toward the studio, toward the kiln, leaving me alone on the living room floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes, holding a photograph I had looked straight at for 10 years and somehow never once seen. The glass still held the warmth of her sister's cruel hands. I found her in the studio. The garage door was rolled halfway up, and the light inside was warm and orange from the kiln. She was standing at her wheel with her back to me, not throwing anything, just standing there with her dusty hands flat on the cold clay, breathing like she'd run a distance. The whole room smelled of dry earth and fired glaze. I stopped in the doorway. The porch light from the house reached just far enough to lay a pale stripe across the concrete between us. Cora. You don't have to say anything. She didn't turn around. Please. I know how this looks. I know what she made it sound like. It wasn't like that. Tell me what it was like, then. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she wiped her hands slowly on her apron, and she turned to face me, and to her credit she didn't cry, and she didn't crumble. She just looked at me, steady, the way her father used to. I was 20 when you started coming around, she said. You'd sit at the end of the table by the window, and you'd listen to my dad's stories like they were worth something, and you'd fix things around the house that nobody asked you to fix. You never made a big deal of any of it. You were just, good. In a plain, quiet way that nobody in this family ever seemed to notice except me. She took a breath. And you were my sister's husband. So I said nothing. For 10 years I said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have blown a hole in everyone's life. That's the whole confession, Sawyer. I didn't do anything. I just felt something and kept it in a drawer. The photograph, I said. The one with your dad. Something in her face gave way, just a little. It had my dad in it. That part was true. A small, broken smile. It just wasn't the only true thing. I thought about all of it then, the coffee she never had to ask about, the chair by the window that was always clean, the bookshelf she wouldn't let anyone wrap, the 10 years of standing at the edge of every room and asking for nothing. A person can love you that quietly, that patiently, and you can walk right through the middle of it every day and mistake it for the weather. You want to know the worst part, she said, quieter now. It was never even about hoping. I stopped hoping years ago. I'm not some girl waiting by a window. I made my peace with it. I built a life. I have my clay and my mother and my work, and it's a good life, and I never once planned to say a single word of this to you. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. And then you showed up on the porch with a box in your arms, looking like a man who'd forgotten he was allowed to be welcome anywhere. And I opened the door, and it all just stood back up. 10 years of it, standing up at once. I didn't have anything to say to that. Everything I might have said felt too small for the size of what she'd carried, alone, all those years, without ever once asking me to carry a single ounce of it. And then, because I'm a man who has spent a lot of his life talking himself out of good things, I felt the old reflex kick in. Cora, you don't want this, I said. You don't want me. I'm a 34-year-old man who had one good career and quit it. I fix broken furniture in a rented shop. Whatever you built me up to be, standing at that window all those years, that's not who's actually standing here. You deserve so much more than a man who... Stop. She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her hand flat against my chest, and her palm was cool and dry and dusted with clay, and it stopped me the way a hand on your chest does when it's the right hand. Don't you do that. Don't you dare talk me out of the one thing I've been sure about my entire adult life. Cora. I didn't fall in love with the architect. Her voice was fierce and low and completely certain. I never even met the architect. I don't care about the pavilion, or the award, or your name in the paper, that man is a stranger to me. I fell in love with the one who stayed a man after everything fell apart. The one who kept showing up. The one who carried my mother's boxes and remembered which chair was mine. Her eyes were bright but her voice didn't waver. The whole world remembered your name this week, Sawyer. I loved you when you thought you didn't have one worth remembering. I stood there in the orange light with her hand on my chest, and something 2 years frozen in me came quietly loose. Everyone remembered my name this week, I heard myself say. You remembered me when I had nothing worth remembering. She nodded, and her eyes finally spilled over, and I reached up and covered her clay-dusted hand with mine and held it there against my heart. Out past the open door, the porch light was still burning, warm and yellow, throwing its patient stripe across the concrete, holding the space between the house and the dark. I'd come to that house to give back the last piece of an old life, to set a box on a porch and drive away clean. I understood, finally, standing in the orange light with her heartbeat under my hand, that I was never going to leave. We didn't rush it. Neither of us was built that way. For a while it looked, from the outside, like nothing at all had changed. I still came by the house. Cora still worked her clay while I worked the wood. But the coffee at my elbow meant something now, and the chair by the window had a person in it who wanted me there, and the difference between those two things is the difference between a house and a home. There were Sunday dinners. Lorraine set 3 places again and told her old stories to an audience that had stopped pretending not to love them. Some evenings Cora would come to the shop instead, and we'd work side by side without talking for hours, her at a borrowed table with a lump of clay, me at the bench with a plane, and the hum of her small wheel and the whisper of shavings curling off the wood made a kind of music that I never wanted to turn off. We were 2 people who understood, in our hands, that the good things take time and can't be forced. It turned out love was just another thing you made slowly, and well, and without nails if you could manage it. I want to be honest about how ordinary most of it was, because the ordinariness was the whole point. We were not 2 people swept off our feet. We were 2 careful people learning, slowly, that it was safe to want something out loud. The first time I kissed her it was in the studio, both of us covered in the dust of our separate crafts, and it was so overdue and so unhurried that it felt less like a beginning than like something finally settling into the place it had always belonged. There were small frictions, the way there are. I was a man who trained himself for 2 years to expect very little, and some nights I still braced for the leaving that never came. Cora was patient with that in a way I hadn't earned. She'd catch me going quiet and she'd just put a mug of coffee at my elbow, black, no sugar, exactly right, and sit with me until whatever it was past. She never once asked me to be more than I was. It turned out that was the only thing I'd ever really wanted from anyone. The old house didn't sell. Lorraine had put it on the market that first month, back before any of this, and somewhere in the middle of everything she quietly took the sign back down. She was tired of the idea of strangers in Walter's rooms, she said. And I offered, carefully, because I wasn't yet family and didn't want to presume, to fix the things that had scared off the buyers. The crooked porch step. The hutch that wouldn't come loose. The storm door hinge I'd been meaning to oil for a decade. So I did. Over that winter and into the spring I rebuilt the front porch board by board, and I planed and rehung every door that stuck, and I turned the detached garage into a real studio for Cora, with proper venting for the kiln and north light through a window I framed myself. I did most of the work in the evenings, after the shop closed, with Cora sitting on the tailgate of my truck handing me screws and keeping me company in the cold. Lorraine would bring us coffee and stand in the doorway watching her house become itself again, and more than once I caught her looking at the 2 of us with an expression I can only call relief, like a woman watching something come right that she had long ago given up on. A year passed. I can say that simply now, but you should know a year is a long time to build something you mean to keep. By the following autumn the house on Eastern Avenue looked better than it had in 20 years, and it wasn't a house anyone was selling anymore. It was ours, Cora's and mine, with Lorraine in the downstairs room she had always loved, close to the kitchen, close to the noise of a family that had somehow, against every odd, put itself back together in her lifetime. Bianca was gone for good by then. She'd sent one email, months after that night, something about the house and what she was owed, and Lorraine had answered it in a way that ended the conversation. I never heard from her again. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I wished her no ill at all. She'd taught me something without meaning to, that being wanted for your name is the loneliest kind of wanting there is. Because the funny thing was, the name did come back. That was the test I hadn't seen coming. That spring a letter arrived from the city, on heavy paper with the old firm's logo at the top. Desmond Cole had retired under a small cloud, and the new partners wanted to make things right. There was a title in the letter. A corner office. A salary with a number in it I hadn't seen since I was a younger and hungrier man. They wanted me to come back and lead a studio. It was, on paper, everything I'd walked away from, handed back to me, polished, with an apology folded inside. I read it twice at the kitchen table, in the chair by the window. Then I set it down and looked out at the backyard, where Cora was carrying a tray of finished bowls across the grass from the kiln, steam still rising off the fresh glaze in the cool morning, and I already knew. I told her about the letter that night. I laid it flat on the table between us so she could read it herself. "You kept the shop," she said, when she'd finished. It wasn't a question. There was no fear in it. She knew me by then better than the letter did. "I kept everything worth keeping," I said. I wrote them a kind reply and I said no. Not because the door hadn't finally opened, it had, but because I'd already learned what was on the other side of it, and I'd learned what was on this side too. A small shop that smelled of cedar. A woman whose hands were always dusted with clay. A porch I'd built myself, on a house that wasn't for sale. A year before, I'd driven to that house to give back the past and be gone in 5 minutes. The truth is I never made it off the porch. I set a box down inside that door and I simply never picked my old life back up again, and it took me a full year of ordinary evenings to understand that I hadn't lost anything at all. I just finally arrived. I just didn't know it yet. We hung the photograph in the front room of the house we'd made our own. I did it myself, on a Sunday, with a level and a single brass nail. And when it was straight on the wall, I stood back and I looked at it, really looked, the way I hadn't been able to for 10 years. Walter at the grill. Bianca turned away. Me, squinting at the sun, blind as a post. And Cora, at the edge of the frame, half in shadow, looking at exactly one thing in the whole bright afternoon. In every photograph from all those years, she had been looking at me. I was the one who never turned around. I think about that a lot now. About how the thing I drove across town to give back was the very thing I should never have let go of. About how the loudest love in my life had walked out the door with a designer coat and a blade for a smile, while the truest one had been standing quietly at the edge of every room I ever entered, asking for nothing, waiting for me to lift my eyes from the work in my hands. The quiet ones. The patient ones. The ones who remember how you take your coffee. They're so easy to walk past. We spend our lives chasing the people who make us feel chosen, and we miss the ones who chose us a long time ago and never made a sound about it. So let me ask you 2 things before I go. Have you ever realized that someone loved you for years, only after you'd finally gotten close enough to almost miss it? And if it had been you on that porch that night, box in your arms, would you have set it down and walked away, or stepped inside? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me down below, who was quietly looking at you all along.